Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about that all-important technique curriculum. What do you teach? When do you teach it? How do you teach it? Now, for many of you that are using method books for your students, and you say, well, the method book introduces the scales, and in many cases the pentascales. But I encourage you to consider that an introduction and not the be-all and end-all of what you're going to teach and how you're going to put it together. Often in the method book, they'll have a page that shows the C scale or G scale, has them finger it up and down one octave, and then they have some pieces that follow, possibly 3 or 4 pieces in that key with scales built into the repertoire piece. And that's fine, but that's not going to allow the student enough digest time to be able to play those scales on call. By that I mean, if I have a student walking in and they are in level 3B of, let's say, the Faber, and I ask them to play a G scale, they may struggle remembering it. They haven't looked at it since they looked at the page that had the G scale on it. I'm for building a house of technique, and there's many ways to develop your curriculum. If you have a curriculum, you're more likely to follow it than to just rely on whatever music you have, whatever series you are. I have for years taught my own curriculum. How did I get there? Well, I grew up in the National Guild auditions, and if you are a guild teacher or have heard of it, they have musicianship phases, and those musicianship phases are broken down from elementary A all the way through the senior piano diploma. Each year there is more scales, arpeggios, cadences, transpositions. There's 6 phases that you can choose from. And if you were to follow that curriculum and do 1 level a year, you indeed would be following a curriculum that will add to your students' level of ability. They go from 1 octave to 2 octaves. In that case, they go to 3 octaves with triplets, and finally 4 octaves sixteenths. But perhaps you prefer something else. If you're a member of Music Teachers National Association, many states, although not all, have keyboard skills programs. Sometimes these keyboard skills programs have keyboard skills days where you can enter your student and they can be evaluated on the level that they have chosen. Those skills come in usually 10 or 12 levels, and even if you didn't want your student to cooperate, go into that program, you could use that skills as a basis or foundation for your own program. Now, what I'm going to begin to show you today in this video, and in the next video, follow up until you get the whole layout of what I do, is I have developed over the years groupings of scales, and I have developed how much I get done my first year, my second year, and my third year. Now, I'm talking about a student that's coming into your studio brand new, never had piano before, or maybe had 6 months. They're in the primer level book. You're going to teach them. So I start technique right from the get-go. Now, I am a proponent of finding out what works for you and developing your own curriculum. And you can use bits and pieces of other curriculums that are available. There's also pedagogy books that you can purchase that have curriculums within them. One of them is Joanne Haratunian's The Fourth Finger Plays B Flat, which has just been out a few years now. It has an extensive section and even some handouts that you might want to be able to use for your students that explains a technique concept and things that you can hand your students and put in a binder. And speaking of binders, my students all have a 1-inch binder with dividers. One of those dividers is technique. And as I build their skills, I give everything to them in writing so that they don't have to hunt around. I don't write things out. It's already pre-written for their level, and then they have the sheet to go with. Now, I'm going to be discussing shortly how I do the first year. And the first year is so important because that is our foundation for everything that follows. And I believe that you should begin technique study as soon as they get in the primer level to using all 5 fingers, which is a little more than halfway through the primer. You're trying to get to know your student, you're trying to get them used to the lesson, you're teaching the pieces, you're getting some finger things, but there is invaluable use in doing things in the primer level. And let me explain what we're going to do on the first year. Now, if you're with many of the organizations, some states like to use the tetrascale. Let me show you what I mean. When I was learning, I didn't start with pentascales, I started with tetrachords, and in fact many theory programs start with your tetrachord. And so of course you've got 4 fingers, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, playing the first 4 notes of the scale, and 2, 3, 4, 5 playing the second 3 notes of the scale. And many times you can learn this as a takeoff. Then the left hand takes where the right hand was, right hand comes up, I'm following the circle of fifths. I'm now on G major. So now I have 1 sharp, F sharp. And so the student is learning now I'm on G. Now I'm going to take my circle of fifths, and the left hand is going to cover where the right hand was. Right hand, second finger is now on A. And then, of course, now I have 2 sharps. That's an excellent way to begin if you choose to start with a full scale. And in fact, this might be an excellent way to work with a transfer student that has had some years of study but never got any basic foundation of technique. I prefer to do that for a transfer student. What I like to do in my first year is to start with pentascales. And having taught for many years in Virginia, the Virginia State music teachers use pentascales in their first level of keyboard skills. So as soon as you hit the middle ground of the primer book, you can begin introducing the pentascale. After all, that's what they're using in their pieces. I teach the pentascale as the first 5 notes of the scale. And at this point, I'm teaching by rote. I'm not teaching whole steps and half steps yet. I teach that with the first scales. So I teach them C major. And in fact, for a young child, I prefer they not do legato. I prefer that they drop each finger into the key and not worry about legato, because there's a lot of that key pressing and key pushing that I don't even want to get started. So I teach it as just single drops. What the right hand does, the left hand is also going to do. And I leave it at that. And depending on the child's development, as we go through the pentascales, then the day comes, you just know when it is, hey, let's see if we can get this hands together. And you'll see pretty quickly where their dexterity is, and they're able to go ahead and put it together. So in a first technique lesson, I may well teach the C and the G. Again, going around the circle of fifths. Now I do that because C and G have no sharps and flats, and I don't have to mess with the flats and the sharps the first time around. Now, once we get a few weeks into pentascales, and I'm teaching, the next 2 I would teach are D, around the circle of fifths, and A. And what's so wonderful about them is that the 3rd finger is on a black key, and so they are the same play. They are the same game. So it's easy to learn. And finally, A. Okay, that's already 2 weeks in. Now at that point, if I have time, along about the 3rd or 4th week of going into study, I start to teach triads so that they're going to match the triad to the pentascale I've just given them. And especially for small fingers, and 6-year-olds and 5-year-olds have little tiny fingers, what I like to do is teach them that they can play a 1-5-1 tom-tom, and that gets that going, and then if they'll just curve that 3rd finger, we can get a triad, because you know how you end up with, or they're trying to pull their 4th and 2nd fingers up out of the way. We don't want that, because that builds in tension that's totally unnecessary. Again, their dominant hand, which for many children is the right hand, we start with a tom-tom, curve the 3rd, in I go. Now I've added, they play the pentascale, then they play the triad that matches, match. I'm going to say along about 6 weeks of this, we're moving through the white key majors. We now have pentascales and triads. I add the broken hand-over-hand triad, which is a good way to get them moving up and down the piano. So let's say I'm in the key of D. They've just done this. I teach them. Now this, I like legato just because I do. Over with the second or the third finger. Don't let them put the thumb or the pinky there. They'll want to do that. And come back. So now I've developed my program for the year, basically. Once I've gotten, let's say it's Thanksgiving and I got them in August, they're now doing pentascales, major pentascales, hands alone, hands together, separated, the triad, and hand over hand. What if you have a child that's doing great and you're thinking, man, this is great, they really know this, it's not a challenge. Add a set of octaves for the hand over hand. Now we're going to do it twice over, and they're getting across the keys to D and back down. So a good 5, 6, 7 weeks into your beginning of your skills, they should have 7 major pentascales, the triad that matches, and then a hand over hand to go with it, and you've got yourself a little technical routine. Now, probably along January, February, depending on what your schedule is, you can simply change that into the minor pentascales, and by doing what? They learned that they lower the middle note 1/2 step, and now they have minor, and it's all the same thing. Fingering's the same, the approach is the same. You will find they will learn these in a matter of weeks. Once I have the pentascales in the white keys, major, minor, hand over hand, and also the triads, it's time to add an etude book. Now there are several out on the series. By now they're approaching level 1. They're approaching level 1 book, or they're already in it by, say, January. One of the most wonderful series out there, Keith Schnell has a wonderful series, starts with the prep book and goes, I believe it's 10 levels, which takes them practically up through an early advanced level music. Another one is Expressive Etudes by Suzanne Guy and Victoria, I believe it's Victoria MacArthur. I could be wrong on that second name, but you have a choice. You could put half your studio in one and half in another, and the key to all of it, excuse me, the key to all of it is to be able to be sure that you're consistent. Way too often my students come in with a book, let's just say it's Czerny, and they've done the first 4 and then it gets dropped. And there's nothing in the rest of the book that shows there was any consistency in putting this into the lessons. And so therefore then there's a problem, because they barely got started on something and now most of the book is sitting there empty. And I encourage you to decide what you want to do with your curriculum and stick with it. It's the consistency of putting this in every week that's important. Now in the next segment, we're going to talk about how to get into this into your lessons painlessly. And so we'll be right back.